Hi, everybody. It's Movement, Art, and Soul with Karen Sparks, and I'm a counselor, an artist, and a movement artist. This channel is about your personal spiritual journey towards wholeness, enlightenment, integration, individuation, healing, words like that. And today, the topic is, am I in a relationship with a narcissist? So the first thing I want to mention is that there is something called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's released by the APA, the American Psychiatric Association. And in this manual, you get diagnoses by psychiatrists and psychologists about personality disorders, behavior disorders, things like that. So when you talk about narcissism or narcissist or different kinds of things, we are beginning to throw around these terms like psychopath, sociopath. There's just so many other types of these quote unquote disorders that we need to be careful, because these things are actually labels, and these labels are often mixed in with the regular medical model with prescriptions and so on. And so we need to be careful about just throwing around psychological terms and really just realizing when we're talking about something in a general way. So this topic video is not about the medical model, it's about what I see going on in the general public talking about narcissism today and my perspective on that. So first of all, I also want to mention that there is another diagnostic handbook that's released by the WHO, the World Health Organization, called the ICD, which is an international classification of diseases. So any classification, for example, the DSM, which was the personality and behavioral, for example, or the ICD, whatever, some of these classifications help with people's health insurance so that they can get medications if that's the route they're going. So what I'm talking about today is that narcissism has become a very popular term. Not only am I hearing a lot of that these days as a counselor, it's all over the place in articles and web pages and YouTube and things like that. Years ago, I've been counseling for a very long time now. People would just come in talking about dysfunctional relationships or mental, emotional, physical, abusive relationships. Relationships that just weren't working. Most people that came to see me came to talk to me about their inner landscape. I'm feeling like this. I'm feeling anxious or just worried all the time, or I do feel depressed, or I feel just sad all the time, or because my relationships aren't working. These days, I'll hear more the terms narcissism, scapegoat, flying monkeys, all kinds of these other kinds of topics that we have to be careful how we're using them. But I think there's some usefulness to them, because as in the general public, people are getting together in communities, and when they go through these categories, they're saying, oh, when I look up my relationship, there is something wrong. But when I listen to these categories, like 1 to 10 signs of narcissism or different things like that, they go check, 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 check. So if that's helpful, then I think that it's good that you're finding some assistance in at least pinpointing that there is a problem, right? So I think that that can be helpful that way. And it is true that if you take a look at, like, working with as many people as I have, and having gone through my own personal spiritual journey, which has involved, many different things that I've had to look at within myself and my relationships and family too, that these categories can help us to understand not only ourselves, but the dynamic that we attract into our lives. Because when we are growing up, we get conditioned and we have experiences. Those experiences become the only thing we knew. We tend to attract and recreate certain patterns. Sometimes they're very much like what we saw growing up. Sometimes it just is like it in some way, some very important way that leads to very similar behaviors. So for example, if you saw dysfunction growing up, you might attract dysfunctional relationships, but they could be of a different sort with the same underlying kind of conditions, whether it's just a different kind of addiction, a different kind of a mental emotional pattern, and communication strategies and emotional mental strategies and so on. So let's take a look at, am I in a relationship with a narcissist? I'm going to encourage you to change that to, am I in a dysfunctional relationship? But if any of these category topics sound like what you're going through, this is what people generally are calling narcissism or a narcissistic and scapegoat dynamic. One of the first things that is very, very key is that if you feel that you're in a relationship with a person who has some narcissistic traits, it's very difficult for them to take responsibility for their actions when their actions are causing suffering or are inappropriate in a relationship of some sort, leading to suffering and dysfunction. So they may have all kinds of defense mechanisms. So years ago, people would just use these terms, defense mechanisms and dysfunctional relationships and abusive language. That was the language before. Now it's coming along these lines here. And there are many narcissistic type relationships. Because of the amount of people talking about it and identifying with that, we can see that many of these things are true. Besides not taking responsibility as a typical mode of operating, people that have narcissistic tendencies often redirect what you're talking about back onto you. That's another strategy for them not to take responsibility. Any way that they can have that hot seat taken off them, they'll do whatever they can to redirect that. They can project it onto you, so they can project that you have some of the qualities that you're trying to bring up and say that are problematic in the relationship, causing difficulties in the relationship, and they may just project that onto you or even really think that you have them when in fact they do. Now, this can either be conscious or unconscious. As a counselor, people have given me examples where someone with these type of abusive tendencies would say to them, you know, when I first met you, I read you really well, and I could tell that if I did this and this, I would have you exactly where I wanted you. I did this on purpose. I did this to you on purpose because I knew that I could get you to do certain things that I wanted you to do. And then I've heard stories where a person was just, I really did not see I was doing that. I really just didn't see I was doing that. But remember, they tend not to say sorry. Okay? So conscious or unconscious, it's still a behavior that you can find extremely difficult in terms of trying to move forward in a relationship. And that begins to erode whether there is even a deep emotional connection or intimacy to begin with. You may have imagined you were close to this person because of how they make you feel when you first meet. So people on the net, and common language is called love bombing. But, you know, most of the time when we meet someone, we do go through that romantic phase. That's just a common thing in relationship. And then we come to see ourselves more clearly, and these dynamics will come out. So you may find that being emotional, having an emotional connection, being vulnerable, having an intimate connection. Now, intimacy, as we know, that's not just sex. You can be intimate with a family member, with a friend, with a coworker, but with your spouse, the intimacy level, there's intimacy in sex, but intimacy does not equal sex. And they have very difficulties understanding and being intimate and connecting on a deeper level, whether it's to support you, to understand what you're going through, to put themselves in your shoes, which they rarely will do. Things like that. Okay, so do you notice any of that? Do you also notice that you get hooked into some kind of a pattern? And this pattern always leads you to feel the same, whether it's you feel like it's your fault all the time, you feel like you need to say sorry all the time, you feel like in the end it was made all about you, even though they say that that's what you're doing to them. So there's gaslighting, which means that they will end up doing things in a way that you end up feeling very confused. Maybe even people use the word crazy making. So the thing is, with gaslighting, something does happen. They may even say that never happened. They might say that didn't happen the way you're saying it happened. Meanwhile, it did. So I always told people, track your pattern. Write it down. Write down the date, write down the situation, write down your response to that situation, how you handled it, what was your voice level, what was your tone. Try to remember things as accurately as you can. Write down on a circle, starting at the top with the incident, go to the right and just write what was your response, what was their response. Try to track it, what happened, how did it end. Very often, you may find if you're in a relationship with narcissistic tendencies, somehow you end up, when you brought something up about your partner, you end up feeling like, oh God, it was made all about me, but I was trying to talk about this incident in which they were inappropriate, or I wanted to break up an incident that I felt very upset about, or I wasn't being supported, so I brought that incident up, and yet at the end of it, not only do I still not feel supported, I'm somehow feeling guilty. For what? I don't really know. So there's that kind of example of a circle. Track your pattern. Start writing dates down, start writing incidents down, especially if you find that you can relate to this idea around gaslighting, where people make stuff about you, projection, write it down, or when gaslit, where they're denying the reality of what actually happened. A lot of people will come in and tell me that this happened, and now they're saying it never happened. So that a journal is one way that you can go around it. As a counselor, I've had to tell people to keep journals in terms of very other types of examples, whether it's work or some other type of example where they need a record to go over something. Keep a journal. It's important, right? Make sure you're being accurate. That's the other thing. The important thing in this is that you begin to develop the care about the fact that you can remember something with clarity. Care about the fact that you can look into the mirrors of self-reflection and be honest. Develop your level of consciousness, clarity, conscience, and memory to remember what happened properly. They don't often, as a narcissist or a person with narcissist tendencies, treat you equally. For example, it might be easier for them to talk with you if they want to talk about an accomplishment or maybe an issue that they're having that's kind of superficial, like whether it's something about someone else and you're listening to them. But when it's your turn, you don't get that equal treatment. They might turn away. They might become very oppositional about what you're saying. They might roll their eyes. You can tell they're not really listening, but they want you to listen if they're talking about something important to them. If they talk at all. Very often they don't expose their inner world. We're in a healthy relationship. Couples will mutually support each other, mutually be vulnerable, mutually be emotionally available, mutually care about when the other person is in need of support or is going through a challenging time. But it's mutual. We listen to each other. We are intimate with each other. We share equally. So there is this unequal treatment. They also may accuse you of things like cheating, but yet they're the ones who have cheated in some way, even if it's emotional. There's a lot of internet cheating these days, different things like that. So they may be putting things onto you that you're not doing and accusing you of things to keep the spotlight off them always. Narcissistic tendencies in people, as well as other dysfunctional tendencies, tend to project things onto you and blame you because it's very difficult for them to look at themselves. Now, one of the things I wanted to bring up is that in the end, both a person with narcissistic or bullying tendencies or dysfunctional tendencies or abusive tendencies need to look at themselves equally in the mirror as the person involved with them. Meaning that if you are scapegoated, so narcissistic tendencies in people will attract people who tend to be scapegoated, because if you are scapegoated, people are using you, projecting onto you about you being the problem. You're the issue. Why are you always stirring the pot? Why do you always have to bring something up? Why are you always attacking me? Because it's a quote unquote, it feels like an attack to them, even though you're not attacking them. You're trying to resolve an issue or a problem so that things can be better. So scapegoats themselves have patterns from the past, and they need to delve into the past. So the first thing that tends to happen is people begin to think and imagine, am I in an abusive relationship? So usually it's the one being abused, because the abuser, although they may be conscious or unconscious of what's going on, is less likely to seek help initially. I'm saying less. I'm not saying they would never. I'm saying they're less likely to. Usually the people that do go out and seek help first are the ones that are on the receiving end of it, but they equally have their own work to do. And that work is, where did I develop this pattern that I would put up with this kind of behavior? Where did I develop this pattern where I attract people with narcissistic tendencies into my life that don't tend to look at their own issues and take responsibility? Where did I learn that I'm a projection screen for others without holding my space and walking away from a situation like that? Where did I learn to tolerate that? And the first place to look at is with primary caregivers and your family of origin. Do your history, do your work, because that is where we get set up for our patterns. So not only does the person who tends to abuse others, or the bully, or the narcissistic individual need to look at themselves, but the people in relationship with these people need to do their own work. Very often scapegoats, black sheep, people who were targeted, people who were the projection screen, have their own, or codependent relationships, have their own issues to work through. They can develop all kinds of issues that follow them in their life that they need to sort through. They can struggle with addictions. They can have dysfunctional relationship patterns that they continue to attract. They can find themselves feeling all sorts of different things inwardly that reflect into their outer world, making things more challenging for them. They have their own host of things to work through. So my point being here is that the biggest piece of the puzzle is, number one, to identify, are you in a relationship with someone that has narcissistic tendencies? Do you relate to these categories? Are you in a dysfunctional relationship? That's the bigger question. Do you tend to attract that into your life? And what is the history? What's your history? Please seek out counseling. If you need to work through these things, you want some assistance in identifying it, because the step is going to be that you need to look at your own inner landscape. You need to heal that within yourself, which led you to where you are today. Looking up these things. Am I in a relationship with a narcissist? Am I in a dysfunctional relationship? Is this person being abusive towards me? Because a lot of these things, especially if it's very covert, like very hidden, very subtle, very insidious, like slow things over time where you kind of get, I would say it's like being infiltrated, right? Where you just one day wake up, you don't even feel like yourself anymore. Well, both a bully and a victim could end up feeling that way. They're just different dynamics. They're both in pain of different sorts. Many times what we're realizing is that a narcissist comes from a history of PTSD, trauma of some sort, and conditioning in a family where there were no emotions expressed. So some people end up being like scapegoats. Some people end up being more like a bully or more like a narcissist. And it's just a different kind of pattern. And then they end up together and they play out these patterns they saw growing up, right? So I think what I'm trying to say too is that labeling to me is not as important as every individual looking at themselves and saying, what is my pattern and what am I doing? If you really are not taking responsibility, write that down. I don't take responsibility. I get angry, I react, and I turn the tables on my partner. If you're a scapegoat, okay, I bring this topic up. The response that I get is a complete denial redirection. I get lost, I get confused, I start bringing up other things. Whatever your pattern is, how do you end up in this? Do you always end up saying sorry? Do you always end up still hooked in to try to prove your worth? Right? So we have to remember that this too on a subtle level is about energy. There are energy problems in dysfunctional relationships. So the energies are going back and forth, and one person is often being sucked dry. The other person is looking for energy. The tables can turn. It can get really messy. So write down your pattern. I hope that this video has brought some light into your dynamic and to ask the deeper questions, to do some deeper work, to do some deeper digging, and to really, if you heard things that trigger you, write it down. If this is your sign to take a look at what's going on, take this sign. Take it as important, because relationships can cause so much suffering. And it's so important for you, for your own personal synthesis and growth, which is what this channel is about, your own personal work, for you to get further on your path, personally, spiritually, to wholeness, to integration, enlightenment, and so on. And without looking at yourself and what you're attracting into your life or what you may be doing, it's going to be very difficult to get to where you want to be, to feel that higher level of peace in your life. And so until next time, I hope this has brought you more light.